Question 1. The review process indicates that a marketing team at the traveler's companies has requested access to a list of recent policyholders who have experienced a specific type of claim for the purpose of developing targeted outreach campaigns. This request involves sensitive customer information. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and best practices for data handling at the traveler's companies? Option A. Initiate a formal data privacy impact assessment to evaluate the risks and necessary safeguards before any data is shared. Option B. Share the list with the marketing team, but instruct them to use it only for the stated purpose without further documentation. Option C. Immediately provide the list to the marketing team, as they are a legitimate internal business unit. Option D. Inform the marketing team that sharing such data is not possible due to privacy concerns, and decline the request. The correct answer is C. Immediately provide the list to the marketing team, as they are a legitimate internal business unit. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee at the traveler's companies to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing data handling and privacy. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. The pressure to act quickly must be tempered by a thorough understanding of compliance obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively identifying potential data privacy risks and initiating a formal impact assessment. This aligns with regulatory frameworks such as the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, and state-specific data privacy laws e.g. California Consumer Privacy Act CCPA, if applicable to the data in question, that mandate organizations to assess and mitigate risks associated with handling sensitive customer information. By initiating an impact assessment, the employee demonstrates a commitment to compliance, responsible data stewardship, and a structured approach to risk management, ensuring that any potential data exposure is thoroughly evaluated before action is taken. This proactive step is crucial for maintaining customer confidence and adhering to legal obligations. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves immediately sharing the sensitive customer data with the marketing team without a formal risk assessment or authorization fails to comply with data privacy regulations. This bypasses necessary controls designed to protect customer information, potentially leading to unauthorized access or misuse, and violating principles of data minimization and purpose limitation. Such an action could result in significant fines and legal repercussions for the traveler's companies. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request entirely due to fear of non-compliance. While caution is necessary, outright refusal without exploring compliant avenues for information sharing or escalation can hinder legitimate business operations and fail to address the underlying need for the information in a controlled manner. This demonstrates a lack of problem-solving and an incomplete understanding of how to navigate regulatory requirements while still facilitating business needs. Finally, an approach that involves sharing the data with a vague understanding of its intended use, without a clear purpose or documented authorization, also presents a significant regulatory risk. This lack of specificity can lead to data being used for purposes not consented to by the customer, violating privacy principles and potentially breaching contractual obligations or regulatory mandates. Professional reasoning. Professionals at the traveler's companies should adopt a risk-based approach to data handling. When faced with a request for sensitive customer information, the decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the nature of the data requested and its sensitivity. 2. Identifying the purpose for which the data is needed and verifying its legitimacy. 3. Consulting internal policies and relevant regulations e.g. GLBA state privacy laws to determine appropriate handling procedures. 4. If there is any uncertainty or potential risk, initiating a formal impact assessment or seeking guidance from the compliance or legal department. This structured approach ensures that business needs are met responsibly and in full compliance with all applicable laws and ethical standards. Question 2. What factors determine the appropriate regulatory impact assessment for a new insurance product being considered for launch by the traveler's companies? Option A. The projected market demand for the new product and the competitive advantages it offers over existing offerings. Option B. A comprehensive review of all applicable federal and state insurance regulations, consumer protection laws, and industry-specific guidelines relevant to the product's intended market and function. Option C. The potential for the new product to improve the traveler's company's internal operational efficiency and reduce administrative costs. Option D. Anecdotal feedback gathered from a limited number of existing clients regarding their initial impressions of the product concept. Correct answer is B. A comprehensive review of all applicable federal and state insurance regulations, consumer protection laws, and industry-specific guidelines relevant to the product's intended market and function. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the traveler's companies, like any financial institution, operates within a highly regulated environment. Understanding and adhering to these regulations is paramount to maintaining client trust, avoiding legal penalties, and ensuring the company's reputation. The impact assessment of a new product launch requires a thorough understanding of how that product might affect various stakeholders, and crucially, whether it aligns with all applicable laws and guidelines. Careful judgment is required to balance innovation with compliance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all relevant federal and state insurance regulations, as well as any industry-specific guidelines that the traveler's companies must follow in its operating jurisdictions. This includes assessing potential impacts on consumer protection, data privacy, solvency requirements, and fair marketing practices. Regulatory justification stems from the need to comply with statutes like the Insurance Information and Privacy Protection Act, if applicable to the specific product and state insurance department regulations, and potentially federal consumer protection laws. Ethically, it ensures fair treatment of customers and responsible business conduct. An approach that focuses solely on market demand and competitive advantage fails to acknowledge the stringent regulatory landscape governing insurance products. This oversight can lead to the launch of a product that, while potentially profitable, violates consumer protection laws or solvency requirements, resulting in fines, reputational damage, and potential product withdrawal. An approach that prioritizes internal operational efficiency without considering external regulatory impacts is also flawed. While efficiency is important, it cannot supersede legal obligations. Ignoring regulatory compliance in favor of streamlining internal processes can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions if the product is found to be non-compliant. An approach that relies on anecdotal feedback from a small group of existing clients, while potentially useful for product refinement, is insufficient for a full impact assessment. Regulatory compliance requires a systematic and thorough evaluation against established legal frameworks, not just informal client opinions. This approach risks overlooking broader compliance issues that may not be apparent to a limited client sample. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multidisciplinary team including legal counsel, compliance officers, product development specialists, and risk management. This team should conduct a thorough impact assessment that systematically evaluates the proposed product against all applicable federal and state regulations, industry best practices, and ethical considerations. The process should include a risk assessment matrix to identify potential compliance gaps and develop mitigation strategies before product launch. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some clients of the traveler's companies are expressing confusion regarding the specific terms and conditions of a new policy offering, particularly concerning coverage limitations. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the traveler's company's regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities in addressing this feedback? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the policy's disclosure documents and internal communication protocols. Consult with the compliance department to ensure adherence to all relevant U.S. federal and state insurance regulations, and then provide clear, accurate, and accessible explanations to affected clients. Option B. Immediately revise all marketing materials to emphasize the policy's benefits and downplay any potential limitations, as this will likely satisfy client concerns and boost sales. Option C. Advise the client relations team to inform clients that policy terms are standard across the industry and that further clarification is not necessary unless a claim is filed. Option D. Rely on the sales team's understanding of the policy and their ability to verbally clarify any client questions, assuming that most clients will not delve deeply into the fine print. The correct answer is B. Immediately revise all marketing materials to emphasize the policy's benefits and downplay any potential limitations, as this will likely satisfy client concerns and boost sales. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests while adhering to strict regulatory requirements. The traveler's companies, as a regulated entity, must prioritize compliance and ethical conduct above all else. Misinterpreting or disregarding regulatory guidance can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Careful judgment is required to identify the most appropriate course of action that aligns with both business objectives and legal obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the traveler's company's internal policies and relevant U.S. federal and state insurance regulations. This includes understanding the specific disclosure requirements for product features and potential risks. By proactively seeking clarification from the compliance department and ensuring all communications are accurate and transparent, the company upholds its commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical customer engagement. This aligns with the principles of fair dealing and consumer protection mandated by regulatory bodies like the SEC and state insurance departments, which emphasize clear and truthful information dissemination. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on sales targets without considering regulatory disclosure obligations fails to acknowledge the legal framework governing insurance sales. This could lead to misrepresentation or omission of material facts, violating consumer protection laws and potentially triggering regulatory investigations. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or industry best practices without verifying against specific U.S. regulations risks noncompliance. While industry norms can be informative, they do not supersede explicit legal requirements. Finally, an approach that delays addressing the stakeholder feedback or dismisses it as minor overlooks the potential for escalating issues and the importance of a responsive compliance culture, which is a key expectation of regulators. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and its potential regulatory implications. This should be followed by consulting internal compliance resources and relevant legal and regulatory documents. If ambiguity exists, seeking formal guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is crucial. The decision should then be evaluated against the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations, ensuring transparency and fairness in all actions. Question 4. Compliance review shows that a client of the traveler's companies has requested access to a broad range of customer data that, if provided directly, could potentially violate data privacy regulations. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response for a traveler's company's employee? Option A. Seek to understand the specific business objective behind the client's request and explore alternative, compliant methods for providing the necessary information or insights, or clearly explain the regulatory limitations if the original request cannot be met. Option B. Politely inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to internal policies and decline to provide any information. Option C. Provide the client with a summary of the data they requested, omitting specific personal identifiers, without confirming if this redacted information fully complies with all applicable data privacy laws. Option D. Directly provide the client with the requested data, assuming the client has a legitimate business need and will handle it responsibly. The correct answer is D. Directly provide the client with the requested data, assuming the client has a legitimate business need and will handle it responsibly. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an employee of the traveler's companies to navigate a situation where a client's request potentially conflicts with established regulatory requirements for data privacy and security. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client service with the absolute necessity of adhering to legal and ethical obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that, while the traveler's companies aims to be responsive to client needs, it does not compromise the integrity of sensitive information or violate applicable laws. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the data privacy and security laws applicable to the traveler's company's operations within its jurisdiction. This approach prioritizes compliance by seeking to understand the client's underlying need and then identifying compliant methods to fulfill it, or clearly explaining why the request, as stated, cannot be met due to regulatory constraints. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and legal adherence, which are paramount in the financial services industry. It upholds the trust placed in the traveler's companies by its clients and regulators. An incorrect approach that involves directly fulfilling the client's request without verifying its compliance with data privacy regulations is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a direct violation of regulatory mandates designed to protect sensitive information. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying need or explore compliant alternatives, is also professionally deficient. While it avoids regulatory breach, it fails to meet the standard of client service and partnership expected from a reputable firm like the traveler's companies. It can lead to client dissatisfaction and damage the business relationship. A third incorrect approach, which is to provide a vague or misleading assurance to the client that the request will be handled without concrete steps to ensure compliance, is ethically problematic and creates a risk of future regulatory issues. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear identification of the client's request and the potential regulatory implications. This should be followed by a diligent review of applicable laws and company policies. If the request appears to conflict with regulations, the next step is to engage with the client to understand the business purpose behind the request and explore alternative, compliant solutions. If no compliant solution can be found, the professional must clearly and respectfully communicate the regulatory limitations to the client, explaining the reasons behind the inability to fulfill the request as originally posed. Question 5. Risk assessment procedures indicate that the traveler's companies is considering the introduction of a novel insurance product. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for managing the potential risks associated with this new offering? Option A. Rely on the historical performance data of similar, but not identical, products to estimate the risk profile of the new offering, with minimal formal documentation of the assessment process. Option B. Delegate the entire risk assessment process to the product development team, assuming their familiarity with the product will inherently cover all necessary risk considerations. Option C. Prioritize the assessment of potential revenue generation and market share growth, with risk mitigation strategies to be developed only if significant issues arise during the initial sales period. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive, cross-functional risk assessment that identifies, analyzes, and evaluates all potential market, operational, credit, and compliance risks, developing documented mitigation plans based on the findings. The correct answer is C. Prioritize the assessment of potential revenue generation and market share growth, with risk mitigation strategies to be developed only if significant issues arise during the initial sales period. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the traveler's companies, as a financial services institution, operates under stringent regulatory oversight. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practicalities of implementation and the ethical obligation to protect client interests and maintain market integrity. A flawed risk assessment can lead to significant financial losses, reputational damage, and regulatory penalties. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate risks effectively without stifling innovation or creating undue operational burdens. The correct approach involves a proactive and systematic identification, analysis, and evaluation of potential risks associated with a new product launch. This includes considering market, operational, credit, and compliance risks. Specifically, it requires the traveler's companies to develop and document a robust risk assessment framework that aligns with relevant U.S. federal and state insurance regulations, as well as industry best practices. This framework should involve cross-functional teams, clear methodologies for risk scoring, and defined mitigation strategies. Regulatory justification stems from the general principles of prudent risk management expected of all financial institutions, and more specifically, from regulations like those promulgated by state insurance departments that mandate sound financial practices and consumer protection. The ethical imperative is to ensure that new products are not only profitable, but also safe and fair for consumers, and that the company has the capacity to manage the associated risks. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on potential profitability without adequately assessing the downside risks fails to meet regulatory expectations for prudent risk management. This approach neglects the fundamental responsibility to protect policyholders and the company's financial stability, potentially violating state insurance laws that require solvency and fair dealing. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without a structured, data-driven analysis is also professionally unacceptable. This lacks the rigor demanded by regulators and can lead to overlooking novel or emerging risks. Furthermore, an approach that delegates risk assessment entirely to a single department without broader input or oversight creates silos and increases the likelihood of critical risks being missed, which is contrary to the principles of comprehensive enterprise risk management expected by regulatory bodies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape, the specific risks inherent in the proposed activity, and the potential impact on stakeholders. This involves a continuous cycle of risk identification, assessment, mitigation, monitoring, and reporting. When faced with a new product or initiative, the process should begin with a clear definition of objectives and scope, followed by a systematic identification of all potential risks. Each identified risk should then be analyzed for its likelihood and potential impact, leading to an evaluation of its overall significance. Based on this evaluation, appropriate mitigation strategies should be developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring to ensure their effectiveness. This structured, iterative process ensures that risk management is integrated into the business strategy rather than being an afterthought. Question 6. The risk matrix shows a correlation between certain geographic areas and higher claim frequencies for auto insurance policies. An underwriter at the traveler's companies is reviewing an application from a zip code identified in the matrix as having a higher risk profile. The underwriter notes that this zip code is predominantly populated by a minority ethnic group. The underwriter must decide how to proceed with underwriting this application. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical underwriting practices for the traveler's companies in the U.S.? Option A. Investigate the applicant's individual driving record, vehicle type, and other objective risk factors to determine insurability and appropriate premium, while ensuring the geographic data is not used as a proxy for prohibited discrimination. Option B. Increase the premium significantly for the applicant based on the assumption that the higher claim frequency in the zip code reflects a higher personal risk for this individual, regardless of their personal driving history. Option C. Recommend the applicant seek insurance from another provider, citing the general high-risk nature of the zip code as the reason. Option D. Decline the application solely because the applicant resides in a zip code identified as high risk in the matrix, without further investigation into specific risk factors. The correct answer is D. Decline the application solely because the applicant resides in a zip code identified as high risk in the matrix, without further investigation into specific risk factors. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an underwriter at the traveler's companies to balance the need to accurately assess risk with the ethical obligation to avoid discriminatory practices, which are strictly prohibited by U.S. federal and state insurance regulations. The underwriter must interpret the risk matrix in a way that is compliant with fair underwriting principles and avoids proxies for protected characteristics. The correct approach involves analyzing the risk matrix data to identify genuine, actuarially sound risk factors that are permissible under U.S. insurance law. This means focusing on objective criteria directly related to the likelihood and severity of a claim, such as driving history, vehicle type, and geographic location, when used in a non-discriminatory manner. Regulatory frameworks like the Unfair Trade Practices Act, as adopted by many states, and specific state insurance department guidelines prohibit unfair discrimination in underwriting. Therefore, using data points that correlate with protected classes, even if not explicitly stated, would be a violation. An incorrect approach would be to infer or assume a higher risk based on demographic information that is a proxy for protected characteristics, such as zip codes that are predominantly populated by a specific racial or ethnic group, or to make assumptions about an applicant's financial stability based on their perceived socioeconomic status, without objective underwriting criteria. This constitutes unfair discrimination, violating principles of equal treatment and potentially specific state statutes that prohibit discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or other protected classes. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the risk matrix entirely and underwrite solely on subjective judgment, which would fail to meet the company's need for consistent and data-driven risk assessment, and could lead to inconsistent pricing and coverage decisions, potentially exposing the traveler's companies to adverse selection and regulatory scrutiny for lack of adherence to established underwriting guidelines. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding the relevant U.S. federal and state insurance regulations governing underwriting and fair practices. 2. Critically evaluating all data points in the risk matrix for their actuarial relevance and potential for discriminatory impact. 3. Seeking clarification from legal or compliance departments when data points are ambiguous or could be interpreted as proxies for protected characteristics. 4. Documenting the rationale for underwriting decisions, ensuring they are based on objective, permissible risk factors. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a marketing team at the traveler's companies is proposing to use aggregated customer demographic data collected during the initial policy application process to develop targeted advertising campaigns for new insurance products. The team believes this is a standard practice for business growth. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliant approach for the traveler's companies to take? Option A. Utilize the aggregated customer demographic data for the campaign without further customer notification, as the data was collected during the initial application and is not considered personally identifiable information in its aggregated form. Option B. Proceed with the campaign as the data is aggregated and anonymized, and the marketing team has a business need. Option C. Share the aggregated customer demographic data with a trusted third-party marketing analytics firm to develop the campaign, assuming they have their own privacy protocols. Option D. Obtain explicit, informed consent from customers for the use of their aggregated demographic data in targeted advertising campaigns, and ensure the data is handled in accordance with the traveler's company's data privacy policies and relevant U.S. regulations. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the campaign as the data is aggregated and anonymized, and the marketing team has a business need. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the potential conflict between business objectives and regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data privacy and customer information handling within the context of the traveler's companies. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to leverage customer data for business development with the stringent requirements of data protection laws. A hasty or incomplete approach could lead to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and erosion of customer trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions are compliant and ethically sound. The correct approach involves a thorough review and adherence to the traveler's company's internal data privacy policies, which are designed to align with relevant U.S. federal and state regulations, such as the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, and state-specific data breach notification laws. This approach prioritizes obtaining explicit customer consent for data usage beyond initial service provision and implementing robust data anonymization or pseudonymization techniques where appropriate. This ensures that customer privacy is protected while still allowing for valuable business insights. The regulatory justification stems from the legal obligation to safeguard non-public personal information, NPI, and the ethical imperative to be transparent with customers about data usage. An incorrect approach that involves sharing customer data with third-party marketing firms without verifying their compliance with data protection standards poses a significant regulatory failure. This violates GLBA requirements for safeguarding NPI and could lead to unauthorized disclosure, resulting in substantial fines and legal action. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that all data collected is automatically permissible for any business use, disregards the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation inherent in privacy regulations. This can lead to overcollection and misuse of sensitive information. Finally, an approach that relies on vague internal understandings of data usage without documented policies or training creates a compliance vacuum, making it difficult to demonstrate adherence to regulations and increasing the risk of unintentional breaches. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the data in question. This should be followed by a review of the traveler's company's internal policies and procedures related to data handling and privacy. Seeking guidance from the legal and compliance departments is crucial when any ambiguity exists. The decision should always prioritize compliance and customer trust, even if it means a slower or less aggressive business development strategy. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a senior claims adjuster at the traveler's companies, who manages a significant portfolio of commercial property claims, has accepted a part-time consulting role with a firm that specializes in advising businesses on disaster preparedness and risk mitigation. This consulting role, while not directly involving claims advocacy, operates in a closely related industry and could potentially present situations where the adjuster's insights from their claims work might be leveraged in the consulting capacity, or vice versa. The adjuster has not yet informed their direct manager or the affected clients about this new engagement. Which of the following actions represents the most appropriate and ethically sound response for the adjuster to take immediately? Option A. Inform their direct manager but downplay the significance of the consulting role, assuring them that it will not affect their performance or create any conflicts of interest. Option B. Immediately disclose the new consulting engagement to their direct manager at the traveler's companies and proactively inform all affected clients, offering to discuss any potential concerns or alternative arrangements to ensure their continued best interests are protected. Option C. Resign from the consulting role immediately to avoid any potential perception of a conflict, without discussing the matter with their manager or clients. Option D. Continue with both roles as planned, assuming the consulting work is separate enough not to create any actual conflict, and that clients will not be negatively impacted. The correct answer is D. Continue with both roles as planned, assuming the consulting work is separate enough not to create any actual conflict, and that clients will not be negatively impacted. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the ethical handling of client information and potential conflicts of interest within the traveler's companies. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to provide comprehensive service to a client with the imperative to maintain confidentiality and avoid situations that could compromise professional judgment or create the appearance of impropriety. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands in accordance with regulatory expectations and internal company policies. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy. This entails immediately informing the client about the potential conflict of interest arising from the new role and offering to discuss alternative arrangements or solutions. This approach upholds the principles of client advocacy and fiduciary duty by prioritizing the client's best interests and ensuring they are fully aware of any circumstances that might affect the service they receive. It aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure of conflicts and adherence to ethical standards of conduct, ensuring that the traveler's companies operates with integrity and maintains client trust. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the new role without disclosing the potential conflict to the client. This failure to inform the client is a direct breach of ethical obligations and potentially regulatory requirements concerning transparency and conflict of interest management. It erodes client trust and could lead to accusations of self-dealing or a lack of commitment to the client's needs. Another incorrect approach would be to downplay the significance of the new role to the client, suggesting it will not impact the existing relationship. This misrepresentation, even if unintentional, is ethically unsound and can lead to misunderstandings and dissatisfaction. It fails to acknowledge the potential for divided attention or differing priorities that a new role might introduce, thereby not fully serving the client's interests. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to withdraw from the client relationship without consultation. While separation might be a necessary outcome, doing so without discussing the situation and potential alternatives with the client demonstrates a lack of professional courtesy and fails to explore all avenues to maintain the relationship or ensure a smooth transition of services. The professional decision-making process in such situations should begin with identifying the potential conflict. Subsequently, one must assess the nature and severity of the conflict and its potential impact on the client and the traveler's companies. The next step is to consult relevant internal policies and regulatory guidelines. Open and honest communication with the client, presenting the situation and potential solutions, is paramount. If a conflict cannot be effectively managed, a decision regarding the continuation of the relationship or the role should be made collaboratively with the client, prioritizing their best interests and upholding the company's ethical standards. Question 9. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a new, innovative insurance product developed by the traveler's companies has the potential for significant profit generation. However, preliminary reviews indicate that the product's complex structure may present challenges in ensuring full compliance with all state-specific Unfair Trade Practices Acts and could strain existing solvency reserves if initial uptake is unexpectedly high. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for the traveler's companies? Option A. Launch the product in a limited number of states first to gauge market reaction and identify potential issues, deferring a comprehensive review until the product's success is more certain. Option B. Focus solely on the projected profit margins and market demand, assuming that existing regulatory frameworks will adequately cover any unforeseen issues with the new product. Option C. Proceed with the product launch immediately to capitalize on the profit potential, with plans to address any compliance or solvency issues that may arise post-launch. Option D. Conduct a thorough, multi-state regulatory compliance review and a detailed solvency impact assessment involving actuarial, legal, and compliance departments before approving the product for launch. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the product launch immediately to capitalize on the profit potential, with plans to address any compliance or solvency issues that may arise post-launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in the insurance industry where a new product, while potentially profitable for the traveler's companies, carries inherent risks that could impact policyholders and the company's financial stability. The core challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of business growth and profitability with the regulatory obligation to ensure product fairness, solvency, and consumer protection. A hasty approval without thorough due diligence could lead to regulatory scrutiny, reputational damage, and financial losses, while excessive caution could stifle innovation and competitive advantage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review that prioritizes regulatory compliance and consumer protection. This means meticulously assessing the product's actuarial soundness, ensuring that premium rates are adequate, not excessive, and not unfairly discriminatory, as mandated by state insurance laws and regulations. It also requires evaluating the product's impact on the traveler's company's solvency and capital requirements, adhering to solvency standards set by state insurance departments and federal guidelines where applicable. Furthermore, the product's marketing materials and sales practices must be scrutinized to ensure they are not misleading and comply with Unfair Trade Practices Acts. This holistic review, grounded in principles of fairness, solvency, and consumer welfare, aligns with the fiduciary duties of insurance companies and the regulatory framework designed to maintain a stable and trustworthy insurance market. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on the potential profit margin without adequately assessing the associated risks and regulatory implications represents a significant failure. This approach neglects the fundamental responsibility to ensure product fairness and solvency, potentially leading to underpriced policies that could jeopardize the company's financial health or overpriced policies that unfairly burden consumers. Such an oversight would violate principles of actuarial soundness and could contravene state laws prohibiting unfair discrimination in pricing. Prioritizing speed to market above all else, even if it means bypassing thorough risk assessments and regulatory reviews, is another critical failure. This haste can lead to the introduction of products with unforeseen liabilities or compliance gaps, exposing the traveler's companies to regulatory penalties, litigation, and reputational damage. It demonstrates a disregard for the regulatory framework designed to protect policyholders and maintain market integrity. Adopting a wait-and-see attitude, where the product is launched with the intention of addressing potential issues only if they arise, is also professionally unsound. This reactive stance fails to proactively identify and mitigate risks, potentially exposing policyholders to harm and the company to significant financial and legal repercussions. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the company's responsibility to offer sound and compliant products from inception. Professional reasoning. Professionals at the traveler's companies should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the product's design and intended market. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk assessment that considers actuarial, financial, operational, and compliance risks. Key stakeholders, including actuarial, legal, compliance, and product development teams, must collaborate to evaluate the product against all relevant state and federal insurance regulations, solvency standards, and consumer protection laws. A robust internal review process, potentially including pilot programs or phased rollouts, can help identify and address issues before a full launch. The ultimate decision to proceed should be based on a clear demonstration that the product is actuarially sound, financially viable, compliant with all applicable laws, and offers fair value to consumers, thereby safeguarding both the company's interests and the public trust. Question 10. The performance metrics show a significant increase in policy sales attributed to a particular sales team at the traveler's companies, but also indicate a higher than average rate of customer complaints regarding the clarity of policy terms and conditions during the sales process. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to U.S. insurance regulatory frameworks and ethical business practices? Option A. Conduct a detailed review of the sales team's customer interaction recordings and documentation, cross-referencing them with the traveler's company's compliance policies and relevant U.S. state insurance regulations, and consult with the compliance department to address any identified discrepancies. Option B. Immediately implement the sales strategies used by the high-performing team across all sales divisions to replicate the success. Option C. Advise the sales team to continue their current practices, as the increased sales volume indicates customer satisfaction with the product offerings. Option D. Focus on the positive sales growth and instruct the customer service department to handle all complaints efficiently, assuming they are isolated incidents. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement the sales strategies used by the high-performing team across all sales divisions to replicate the success. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at the traveler's companies to interpret performance data in the context of regulatory expectations and ethical conduct, specifically concerning customer interactions and potential misrepresentation. The challenge lies in distinguishing between acceptable business development strategies and practices that could lead to regulatory scrutiny or harm to clients. Careful judgment is required to ensure that sales efforts are both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the performance metrics, cross-referencing them with the traveler's company's internal compliance policies and relevant U.S. insurance regulations. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes adherence to established rules and ethical standards. Specifically, it aligns with the U.S. regulatory framework's emphasis on fair dealing, accurate representation of products, and preventing deceptive practices. By seeking clarification from the compliance department, the individual demonstrates a commitment to understanding and upholding these standards, thereby mitigating risk for both the company and its clients. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing sales figures without considering the underlying customer interactions or regulatory implications is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the U.S. regulatory framework's mandates against unfair or deceptive acts or practices in the insurance industry. Such an approach could lead to violations of state insurance laws and federal regulations, resulting in fines, reputational damage, and potential loss of licenses. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing the observed sales tactics without further investigation or consultation with compliance is also professionally flawed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an assumption that current practices are inherently compliant. This can lead to systemic issues that, if uncovered during an audit or regulatory examination, would reflect poorly on the traveler's company's commitment to compliance and ethical conduct. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, objectively analyze the data and identify potential areas of concern. Second, consult relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, if ambiguity or potential risk exists, proactively engage with the compliance department or legal counsel for guidance. Finally, implement decisions that demonstrably align with both business objectives and regulatory and ethical requirements. Question 11. The risk matrix shows a potential for misrepresentation of coverage terms in a large commercial policy proposal being finalized by the traveler's companies. Your direct supervisor is eager to close the deal before the end of the quarter and suggests downplaying these identified risks to expedite the approval process. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Escalate the identified risks and concerns to the compliance department and legal counsel, providing all supporting documentation, and recommend delaying the policy issuance until the risks are fully understood and mitigated. Option B. Attempt to independently adjust the policy wording to mitigate the risks without informing your supervisor or the compliance department. Option C. Proceed with the policy issuance as suggested by your supervisor, assuming the risks are minor and will not significantly impact the company. Option D. Inform your supervisor that you will proceed with the policy issuance, but will not personally sign off on the risk assessment documentation. The correct answer is A. Escalate the identified risks and concerns to the compliance department and legal counsel, providing all supporting documentation, and recommend delaying the policy issuance until the risks are fully understood and mitigated. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's financial interests with ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a conflict of interest, where an employee might be tempted to overlook or downplay risks to secure business. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not solely driven by short-term gains, but are grounded in sound risk management principles and adherence to the traveler's company's ethical code and relevant U.S. insurance regulations. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and escalating potential compliance issues, even if it means delaying or potentially losing a deal. This aligns with the fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the company and its clients, as well as regulatory requirements that mandate robust compliance programs and accurate risk assessment. By raising concerns through the appropriate channels, the employee upholds the integrity of the traveler's company's operations and demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. This proactive stance prevents potential future financial and reputational damage that could arise from noncompliance. An incorrect approach of overlooking the identified risks to secure the business would be a failure to adhere to internal risk management policies and potentially U.S. state insurance laws that require accurate representation of policy terms and conditions. This could lead to mispriced policies, inadequate coverage, and ultimately, claims that the traveler's companies is not adequately prepared to handle, resulting in financial losses and regulatory scrutiny. Another incorrect approach of proceeding without proper documentation of the identified risks and mitigation strategies would violate internal control procedures and create a lack of transparency. This makes it difficult to track risk exposure and can hinder future audits or investigations, potentially leading to penalties. Finally, an incorrect approach of attempting to resolve the issue independently without consulting compliance or legal departments would bypass established governance structures. This could result in actions that are not in line with company policy or regulatory requirements, exposing the traveler's companies to significant legal and financial risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying potential conflicts or risks, 2. Consulting internal policies and relevant regulations, 3. Escalating concerns to appropriate internal stakeholders, e.g., compliance legal management, 4. Documenting all communications and decisions, 5. Acting with integrity and transparency, even when it presents short-term challenges. Question 12. The evaluation methodology shows that a traveler's company's underwriter, while reviewing a complex commercial property insurance renewal application, discovers a significant underwriting risk that, if fully disclosed to the client, might lead them to seek coverage elsewhere. However, the underwriter also recognizes that a slight adjustment in the policy wording, which would still be compliant with U.S. insurance regulations, could mitigate this risk for the traveler's companies while potentially increasing the client's future premium costs. The underwriter is considering how to proceed. Option A. Proceed with the renewal as is, without disclosing the specific underwriting risk or adjusting the wording, hoping the risk does not materialize. Option B. Fully disclose the underwriting risk to the client and discuss potential mitigation strategies, even if it means the client might seek coverage from another insurer. Option C. Seek advice from a senior underwriter on how to present the information to the client in a way that minimizes the likelihood of them seeking alternative coverage, without fully disclosing the extent of the risk. Option D. Adjust the policy wording to mitigate the risk for the traveler's companies without explicitly detailing the discovered underwriting risk to the client, assuming the wording remains compliant with U.S. regulations. The correct answer is B. Fully disclose the underwriting risk to the client and discuss potential mitigation strategies, even if it means the client might seek coverage from another insurer. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at the traveler's companies due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the company's potential financial gain, particularly when dealing with sensitive information and regulatory compliance. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to act ethically and in accordance with the specific regulatory framework governing insurance operations in the United States, as this is the jurisdiction for the traveler's company's hiring assessment test. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering strictly to the traveler's company's internal policies and relevant U.S. insurance regulation. This means transparently communicating any potential conflicts of interest to the client and seeking appropriate internal guidance or client consent before proceeding with actions that could be perceived as self-serving or detrimental to the client's financial well-being. This aligns with the fiduciary duties often implied or explicitly stated in U.S. insurance law and ethical codes, which mandate acting with utmost good faith and loyalty towards the client. Specifically, regulations like those governing unfair trade practices and disclosure requirements would be paramount. An incorrect approach would be to leverage the client's confidential information for personal or company gain without full disclosure and consent. This could violate U.S. federal and state laws concerning data privacy and consumer protection, as well as specific insurance regulations designed to prevent predatory practices. Another incorrect approach would be to downplay or ignore the potential conflict of interest, proceeding with actions that benefit the traveler's companies at the client's expense. This demonstrates a failure to uphold ethical standards and could lead to regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and legal liabilities for both the individual and the company. A third incorrect approach would be to seek advice solely from colleagues without consulting established company policy or legal counsel, as this bypasses the formal channels designed for navigating complex ethical and regulatory dilemmas. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Identifying the potential conflict of interest and its implications. 2. Consulting the traveler's company's code of conduct and relevant internal policies. 3. Reviewing applicable U.S. federal and state insurance regulations. 4. Seeking guidance from supervisors or the company's legal/compliance department. 5. Communicating transparently with the client about the situation and potential resolutions. 6. Documenting all decisions and communications. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows that a senior underwriter at the traveler's companies has identified a potential opportunity to secure a significant new client by offering a slightly modified policy structure that would benefit the client's specific needs, while also aligning with a new product development initiative within the traveler's companies. However, the underwriter also recognizes that this modified structure, while compliant, might involve a slightly higher risk profile than standard offerings, and the full implications of this risk haven't been fully communicated to the client's broker. What is the most appropriate course of action for the underwriter to take, considering the regulatory framework and ethical obligations in the U.S. insurance market? Option A. Inform the client's broker that the modified policy is a special offering and proceed without detailing the specific risk nuances, as the overall benefit to the client is substantial. Option B. Immediately disclose the potential higher risk profile to the client's broker, seek their input, and obtain explicit client acknowledgement of the risk before finalizing any policy terms, while also consulting the traveler's company's compliance department regarding the new product initiative. Option C. Proceed with the modified policy structure, as it benefits the client and aligns with company initiatives, assuming the broker will perform their due diligence. Option D. Delay the decision on the modified policy until the new product development initiative is fully launched and all associated risks are definitively quantified by the traveler's company's actuarial department. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the modified policy structure, as it benefits the client and aligns with company initiatives, assuming the broker will perform their due diligence. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at the traveler's companies due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the company's potential financial gain, particularly when dealing with sensitive information and regulatory compliance. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to act ethically and in accordance with the specific regulatory framework governing insurance operations in the United States. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering strictly to the traveler's company's internal policies and relevant U.S. insurance regulations. This means transparently communicating any potential conflicts of interest and seeking appropriate guidance or approval before proceeding with actions that could be perceived as self-serving or detrimental to the client. Regulatory frameworks, such as those enforced by state insurance departments and federal laws like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, concerning customer data privacy, mandate a fiduciary duty to clients and prohibit deceptive practices. Ethical guidelines also reinforce the importance of integrity and avoiding situations where personal interests could compromise professional judgment. An incorrect approach would be to leverage confidential client information for personal or departmental gain without proper disclosure or authorization. This directly violates the trust placed in the traveler's companies by its clients and breaches regulatory requirements concerning data security and fair dealing. Another incorrect approach is to downplay or ignore a potential conflict of interest, hoping it will not be discovered. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for both ethical standards and regulatory oversight, which can lead to severe penalties for the individual and the company, including fines, license revocation, and reputational damage. Failing to consult with legal or compliance departments when faced with such a dilemma is also a critical error, as these departments are specifically tasked with ensuring adherence to the complex web of U.S. insurance laws and company policies. Professionals at the traveler's companies should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This involves a thorough understanding of company policies, ethical codes, and applicable U.S. regulations. When a conflict is identified, the next step is to seek clarification and guidance from supervisors, legal counsel, or the compliance department. Transparency and documentation of all decisions and communications are crucial. If a situation cannot be resolved ethically or in compliance with regulations, the professional should escalate the issue and, if necessary, recuse themselves from the decision-making process. Question 14. The monitoring system demonstrates unusual activity patterns associated with an employee's access to sensitive client data at travelers. The data suggests potential policy violations, but the exact nature and intent are unclear. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the employee's direct manager? Option A. Ignore the monitoring data, assuming it is a false positive or not significant enough to warrant further investigation. Option B. Report the raw monitoring data to senior management for immediate disciplinary review without any preliminary investigation. Option C. Immediately confront the employee with the monitoring data and demand a detailed explanation for their actions. Option D. Initiate a confidential, fact-finding inquiry involving HR and legal counsel to understand the context and verify potential policy violations before any direct employee engagement. The correct answer is D. Initiate a confidential, fact-finding inquiry involving HR and legal counsel to understand the context and verify potential policy violations before any direct employee engagement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's need for operational efficiency and risk mitigation with an employee's right to privacy and the potential for misinterpretation of data. The monitoring system's findings, while potentially indicative of a problem, are not definitive proof of misconduct. Acting solely on the raw data without further investigation could lead to unfair accusations, damage employee morale, and potentially violate company policy or regulatory guidelines regarding employee monitoring and data privacy. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any action taken is fair, consistent with travelers' ethical standards, and compliant with applicable U.S. regulations. The correct approach involves initiating a confidential, fact-finding inquiry. This approach is best professional practice because it respects due process and avoids premature judgment. By discreetly gathering more information, such as reviewing relevant policy documents, consulting with HR and legal counsel, and potentially having a private, non-accusatory conversation with the employee to understand the context, travelers can ascertain whether any policy violations have occurred. This method aligns with ethical principles of fairness and natural justice, and it is consistent with U.S. employment law principles that require a reasonable basis for disciplinary action and protect employees from unwarranted intrusion. An incorrect approach would be to immediately confront the employee with the monitoring data and demand an explanation, implying guilt. This fails to acknowledge that the data might be misinterpreted, or that there could be legitimate reasons for the observed activity. It also bypasses established HR procedures and could create a hostile work environment, potentially leading to legal challenges related to wrongful termination or defamation if the employee is disciplined without proper investigation. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the monitoring data entirely, assuming it is not significant enough to warrant attention. This is professionally unacceptable because it abdicates responsibility for ensuring compliance with company policies and maintaining a secure and ethical work environment. It also misses an opportunity to identify and address potential risks or policy breaches that could have broader implications for travelers. A third incorrect approach would be to immediately report the findings to senior management without any preliminary investigation or consultation with HR. While transparency is important, bypassing the initial fact-finding stage can lead to rushed decisions based on incomplete information, potentially causing unnecessary alarm or leading to inappropriate actions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge the data. Recognize that the monitoring system has flagged something that warrants attention. 2. Assess the nature of the flag. Understand what the data suggests and its potential implications. 3. Consult internal policies and legal counsel. Determine if the observed activity, if true, would constitute a policy violation and what legal considerations apply. 4. Initiate a discrete fact-finding process. Gather additional context and information without prejudicing the employee. This may involve reviewing documentation, speaking with relevant internal departments like HR or legal, and potentially having a private, open-ended conversation with the employee. 5. Evaluate findings. Based on all gathered information, determine if a policy violation has occurred. 6. Take appropriate action. If a violation is confirmed, follow established disciplinary procedures fairly and consistently. If no violation is found, document the inquiry and close the matter. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, fair, and compliant with both ethical standards and legal requirements. Question 15. System analysis indicates that a long-term client of the traveler's companies, with whom you have a strong professional relationship, has recently engaged in a series of transactions that appear unusual and potentially indicative of money laundering activities. You have observed these transactions through your regular duties. You are aware of the company's policies regarding suspicious activity reporting. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for you to take? Option A. Ignore the transactions as they are from a long-term valued client and you do not want to jeopardize the relationship. Option B. Conduct your own informal investigation to gather more definitive proof before reporting. Option C. Document your observations and immediately report the suspicious activity to the traveler's company's designated compliance department. Option D. Directly question the client about the nature of these transactions to understand their purpose. The correct answer is D. Directly question the client about the nature of these transactions to understand their purpose. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at the traveler's companies due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to comply with regulatory reporting requirements. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the applicable U.S. federal regulations governing insurance and financial services, specifically those related to suspicious activity reporting. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the duty to protect client information with the legal obligation to report potential illicit activities to the appropriate authorities. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the situation internally to the designated compliance or legal department at the traveler's companies, without directly confronting the client or attempting to investigate independently. This is the professionally sound and legally mandated course of action. U.S. federal regulations, such as the Bank Secrecy Act, BSA, and its implementing regulations, require financial institutions, including insurance companies, to report suspicious transactions that may involve money laundering, terrorist financing, or other financial crimes. By reporting internally, the employee ensures that the company can conduct a proper investigation in accordance with its established procedures and regulatory obligations, thereby protecting both the client's privacy to the extent possible while fulfilling reporting duties. This internal escalation also shields the employee from personal liability and ensures the matter is handled by trained professionals equipped to manage such sensitive situations. An incorrect approach would be to directly confront the client about the suspicious activity. This is professionally unacceptable because it could tip off the client, allowing them to further conceal their activities or destroy evidence, thereby hindering any potential investigation and violating the spirit of regulatory reporting. Ethically, it also breaches the trust placed in the employee by the client. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the suspicious activity and take no action. This is a severe regulatory failure, as it directly contravenes the BSA and other relevant regulations that mandate reporting. Such inaction could expose the traveler's companies to significant fines, penalties, and reputational damage. Furthermore, it represents an ethical lapse by failing to uphold the company's commitment to preventing financial crime. A third incorrect approach would be to conduct an independent, informal investigation without proper authorization or expertise. This is professionally risky as it could lead to mishandled evidence, incorrect conclusions, and potential legal repercussions for both the employee and the company, while still failing to meet the formal reporting requirements. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the company's internal policies and procedures for handling suspicious activity. Employees should be trained to recognize red flags and know the designated channels for escalation. When faced with a potentially suspicious situation, the immediate steps should be to document observations factually and then report to the appropriate internal department, e.g., compliance, legal, or a designated suspicious activity reporting officer, without delay. This ensures that the matter is handled by those with the authority and expertise to investigate and report according to regulatory mandates, while minimizing risk to the employee and the organization. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that a prospective client for the traveler's companies, operating in a niche industry with unique operational risks, has expressed concern about the initial premium quote, suggesting that a competitor offered a significantly lower rate based on preliminary discussions. The client is seeking reassurance that travelers can match this rate. How should the traveler's representative proceed? Option A. Suggest to the client that certain risk factors can be downplayed or omitted from the application to achieve a lower premium, aligning it closer to the competitor's offer. Option B. Explain that the premium is based on a comprehensive risk assessment and underwriting guidelines, and offer to conduct a detailed review to determine the most accurate and appropriate coverage and pricing for the client's specific circumstances, even if it means the initial quote may need adjustment based on findings. Option C. Advise the client that the competitor's quote is likely based on a less thorough assessment, and that traveler's higher quote reflects superior coverage, encouraging the client to accept the current quote to ensure adequate protection. Option D. Immediately inform the client that traveler's rates are competitive and suggest the client provide the competitor's quote for direct comparison and potential matching, without further internal review. The correct answer is B. Explain that the premium is based on a comprehensive risk assessment and underwriting guidelines, and offer to conduct a detailed review to determine the most accurate and appropriate coverage and pricing for the client's specific circumstances, even if it means the initial quote may need adjustment based on findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at the traveler's companies due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the company's potential financial gain, particularly when dealing with sensitive information. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of regulatory obligations and ethical principles governing insurance professionals in the United States. Careful judgment is essential to avoid actions that could be construed as misrepresentation, fraud, or a breach of fiduciary duty. The correct approach involves prioritizing transparency and adherence to established underwriting guidelines. This means accurately assessing the risk presented by the potential client based on all available information, including the preliminary discussions, and then applying travelers' underwriting standards consistently. This approach is professionally sound because it upholds the integrity of the underwriting process, ensures fair treatment of all applicants, and complies with U.S. insurance regulations that mandate accurate risk assessment and prohibit discriminatory practices. It aligns with the ethical duty to act in the best interest of both the client by offering appropriate coverage at a fair price, and the company by managing risk effectively. An incorrect approach would be to prematurely offer a favorable premium based on incomplete information or a desire to secure the business. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the crucial underwriting process, potentially exposing the traveler's companies to unmanaged risks and leading to inaccurate pricing. Such an action could violate state insurance laws requiring fair and equitable rating practices and could be seen as misleading the client, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns outright without a thorough review, especially if the initial information suggests a potential for coverage. This is professionally unsound, as it fails to demonstrate due diligence and could alienate a potential client. It also risks overlooking a viable business opportunity that could be accommodated within travelers' risk appetite through appropriate policy terms or endorsements. Ethically, it falls short of the commitment to provide a fair assessment of coverage options. A third incorrect approach would be to suggest to the client that the premium can be manipulated or that certain risk factors can be overlooked to achieve a lower rate. This is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. It constitutes potential misrepresentation and could be interpreted as an attempt to defraud the company or the client, violating principles of honesty and integrity fundamental to the insurance industry, and potentially leading to severe legal and professional consequences. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured approach. First, gather all necessary information to understand the client's needs and the associated risks. Second, consult travelers' established underwriting guidelines and consult with senior underwriters or risk management if the situation is complex or falls outside standard parameters. Third, communicate transparently with the client about the underwriting process, the factors influencing the premium, and the available coverage options. Finally, document all decisions and communications thoroughly. Question 17. Upon reviewing a client's insurance needs at the traveler's companies, an employee identifies a potential recommendation that would be more profitable for the company, but may not be the absolute most cost-effective solution for the client's specific, long-term financial goals. The employee is aware of a slightly less profitable but more suitable alternative for the client. What is the most appropriate course of action for the employee to take? Option A. Fully disclose the potential conflict of interest and the alternative option to the client, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Option B. Recommend the more profitable option to the client but subtly downplay the benefits of the alternative to encourage acceptance of the preferred choice. Option C. Advise the client that the company's standard recommendations are always in their best interest and proceed with the more profitable option without further discussion of alternatives. Option D. Proceed with the recommendation that is more profitable for the traveler's companies, assuming the client will benefit sufficiently from the coverage. The correct answer is A. Fully disclose the potential conflict of interest and the alternative option to the client, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at the traveler's companies due to the inherent conflict between client interests and the company's potential financial gain, particularly when dealing with sensitive information. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of regulatory obligations and ethical principles governing insurance professionals. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that advice provided is solely in the client's best interest, free from any undue influence or perceived conflict. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's needs and regulatory compliance above all else. This means proactively identifying potential conflicts of interest and disclosing them transparently to the client, allowing them to make an informed decision. This aligns with the fundamental ethical duty of a fiduciary and the regulatory requirements of the U.S. insurance industry, which mandate acting in good faith and with the utmost integrity towards clients. Specifically, state insurance laws and regulations, often mirroring NAIC, National Association of Insurance Commissioners, Model Acts, emphasize fair dealing, disclosure, and avoiding misrepresentation or deceptive practices. By seeking guidance from the traveler's company's compliance department, the employee demonstrates adherence to internal policies designed to uphold these external regulatory standards. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the recommendation without full disclosure, hoping the client would not discover the potential conflict. This failure directly violates the principle of transparency and could be construed as a deceptive practice under state insurance laws. It erodes client trust and exposes both the employee and the traveler's companies to significant regulatory penalties, including fines, license revocation, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns and proceed with the original recommendation without further investigation or discussion. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the client's well-being, potentially leading to a breach of fiduciary duty and violations of regulations requiring fair treatment of all policyholders. Finally, attempting to subtly influence the client towards the more profitable option without explicit disclosure is unethical and a form of misrepresentation, which is strictly prohibited by insurance regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This involves a thorough understanding of the client's needs, the products being offered, and any personal or company incentives. If a conflict is identified, the next step is to consult internal compliance policies and relevant regulations. Transparency and open communication with the client are paramount. If the conflict cannot be resolved in a way that fully protects the client's interests, the professional should decline to proceed or seek alternative solutions that are unequivocally in the client's best interest. Question 18. The control framework reveals that a long-standing client of the traveler's companies is requesting an immediate, significant alteration to their existing policy. The requested change, while seemingly straightforward from the client's perspective, appears to deviate from the standard underwriting guidelines and documentation requirements outlined in the traveler's company's internal policy manual and potentially U.S. state insurance regulations. The client emphasizes the urgency of the situation, implying that failure to act quickly could result in substantial financial loss for them. Option A. Decline the client's request outright, citing internal policy limitations without exploring potential alternative solutions or the possibility of a formal review process. Option B. Make a provisional, undocumented adjustment to the policy based on the client's verbal confirmation, with the intention of formalizing it later once the immediate urgency has passed. Option C. Inform the client that the request cannot be processed immediately due to the need to follow standard underwriting and documentation procedures, and outline the steps and timeline involved in reviewing and approving such a change according to the traveler's company's policies and U.S. insurance regulations. Option D. Proceed with the policy alteration immediately to satisfy the client's urgent request, assuming the client's assessment of urgency is accurate and the potential financial loss outweighs the procedural deviation. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the policy alteration immediately to satisfy the client's urgent request, assuming the client's assessment of urgency is accurate and the potential financial loss outweighs the procedural deviation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee at the traveler's companies to balance competing priorities, adhering to internal policies and regulatory requirements while also responding to a client's urgent request. The pressure to satisfy a client can sometimes lead to overlooking or circumventing established procedures, which can have significant compliance and reputational consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that client needs are met without compromising the integrity of the company's control framework. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the traveler's company's established compliance policies and relevant U.S. insurance regulations. This means recognizing that while client satisfaction is important, it cannot come at the expense of regulatory compliance or internal control procedures designed to prevent fraud, errors, and misrepresentations. Specifically, if the client's request involves a change that requires specific documentation or a formal underwriting process, the employee must follow those established procedures, even if it causes a delay. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the fiduciary duty to operate within legal and ethical boundaries. U.S. insurance regulations, such as those governing policy changes and disclosures, mandate that such actions are properly documented and approved to protect both the client and the insurer. An incorrect approach would be to immediately fulfill the client's request without verifying if it aligns with travelers' policies and U.S. insurance regulations. This could lead to issuing a policy or making a change that is not properly underwritten, documented, or authorized, potentially exposing the traveler's companies to regulatory penalties, financial losses, or reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass the standard approval process by making a verbal agreement or a quick, undocumented adjustment. This failure to follow established procedures violates internal controls and can be seen as a lack of due diligence, which is a critical ethical and regulatory failing in the insurance industry. Such actions can also create a precedent for future noncompliance. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the request, then identifying the relevant internal policies and external regulations. If there is any ambiguity or conflict, the next step is to consult with the appropriate internal compliance or legal department. The decision should always be to act in a manner that is compliant with both internal standards and regulatory requirements, even if it means explaining to the client why a certain request cannot be immediately accommodated and what the proper process entails. Question 19. The control framework reveals a potential weakness in the data access logging mechanism for a critical customer database at the traveler's companies. The identified issue suggests that certain administrative actions may not be fully captured, raising concerns about auditability and potential unauthorized access. Which of the following represents the most appropriate initial response to this finding? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation to understand the scope, root cause, and potential impact of the logging deficiency, involving relevant IT and compliance teams, before proposing a remediation plan. Option B. Immediately deploy a new, more comprehensive logging solution across all relevant systems to ensure complete data capture. Option C. Classify the finding as a low-priority issue and monitor the situation without immediate corrective action. Assuming the risk is minimal, Option D. Escalate the finding directly to the Chief Information Security Officer for an immediate system-wide overhaul of logging protocols. Correct answer is B. Immediately deploy a new, more comprehensive logging solution across all relevant systems to ensure complete data capture. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient risk mitigation with the imperative to adhere strictly to travelers' internal policies and relevant U.S. insurance regulations. The core difficulty lies in identifying and responding to a potential control weakness without overreacting or underreacting, ensuring that any proposed action is both effective and compliant. The pressure to demonstrate proactive risk management must not lead to shortcuts that could compromise data integrity or regulatory standing. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of assessing the identified control weakness. This entails gathering sufficient evidence to understand the scope and potential impact of the deficiency, consulting with relevant internal stakeholders, such as IT security and compliance departments, and then proposing a remediation plan that aligns with travelers' established risk appetite and regulatory obligations. This methodical process ensures that actions are proportionate, well-justified, and auditable, thereby upholding the principles of sound internal control and regulatory compliance as mandated by frameworks like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act (SOX) and state insurance department regulations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement a broad, untested technical solution without proper assessment. This bypasses the critical step of understanding the root cause and potential unintended consequences, risking disruption to business operations and potentially introducing new vulnerabilities. It also fails to involve key stakeholders, which is essential for comprehensive risk management and ensuring alignment with travelers' overall strategy. Furthermore, such an approach might not be adequately documented, hindering future audits and demonstrating a lack of adherence to established internal control procedures. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the finding as minor without sufficient investigation. This demonstrates a failure to appreciate the potential systemic impact of control weaknesses, which could lead to significant financial losses, reputational damage, or regulatory sanctions. It neglects the professional responsibility to identify and address risks proactively, potentially violating the duty of care owed to the company and its stakeholders. A third incorrect approach would be to escalate the issue to senior management without first conducting a preliminary assessment and attempting to gather more information. While escalation is sometimes necessary, doing so prematurely without a clear understanding of the problem can overwhelm leadership with unverified concerns, hindering efficient decision-making and demonstrating a lack of initiative in problem-solving. It also fails to leverage the expertise within the risk and compliance functions at travelers. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, understand the finding and its context. Second, gather evidence to assess its impact and root cause. Third, consult with relevant subject matter experts and stakeholders. Fourth, develop a proportionate and compliant remediation plan, and finally, document all steps and decisions thoroughly. This ensures that risk management is both effective and ethically sound, aligning with regulatory expectations and travelers' commitment to strong corporate governance. Question 20. Examination of the data shows that a senior underwriter at the travelers' companies has a close personal friendship with the CEO of a rapidly growing insurance brokerage firm that is actively seeking to place a significant volume of new business with the travelers' companies. The underwriter is aware of this relationship and is being asked to review and potentially approve the brokerage firm's applications. Option A. Inform colleagues within the underwriting department about the friendship, but refrain from formally disclosing it to compliance, believing it is not significant enough to warrant formal reporting. Option B. Proceed with reviewing the brokerage firm's applications, assuming the personal friendship will not influence professional judgment. Option C. Proactively disclose the personal friendship to the traveler's company's compliance department and seek guidance on managing the potential conflict of interest. Option D. Seek advice from the CEO of the brokerage firm on how best to handle the situation to ensure the business is placed with the traveler's companies. Correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the personal friendship to the traveler's company's compliance department and seek guidance on managing the potential conflict of interest. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee of the traveler's companies to navigate potential conflicts of interest and uphold the company's commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The core of the challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate business development activities and actions that could be perceived as offering undue influence or preferential treatment, thereby violating regulatory principles. Careful judgment is required to ensure all interactions with potential clients or partners align with the traveler's company's internal policies and applicable U.S. insurance regulations. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the relationship to the appropriate internal compliance department at the traveler's companies. This allows the company to assess any potential conflicts of interest and implement necessary safeguards or recusal procedures. This approach is the best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement for transparency and the ethical obligation to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. By engaging the compliance department, the employee ensures that the traveler's companies can fulfill its duty to operate with integrity and adhere to U.S. insurance laws, which often mandate disclosure of relationships that could influence business decisions. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the business discussion without disclosure fails to acknowledge the potential for a conflict of interest. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure because it bypasses the established internal controls designed to prevent compliance breaches. Such an action could lead to a violation of U.S. insurance regulations concerning fair dealing and the prevention of undue influence. Another incorrect approach of downplaying the relationship's significance to colleagues, while still not disclosing it to compliance, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the seriousness of potential conflicts of interest and the importance of full transparency with the compliance function. It represents an ethical failure to act in good faith and a potential regulatory risk if the undisclosed relationship later impacts a business decision. Finally, an incorrect approach of seeking advice only from the potential client's representative, rather than the traveler's company's internal compliance team, is a critical error. This prioritizes external influence over internal governance and regulatory adherence, creating a direct conflict with the employee's fiduciary duty to the traveler's companies and its stakeholders. It is a clear regulatory and ethical failure to seek guidance that could be biased and not aligned with U.S. insurance compliance standards. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the traveler's company's code of conduct and compliance policies. When faced with a situation that might involve a conflict of interest, the employee should first identify the potential conflict. Then, they should consult the company's internal policies and procedures for guidance. The next crucial step is to proactively disclose the situation to the designated compliance or legal department. This ensures that any potential issues are addressed appropriately and in accordance with all applicable U.S. regulations, safeguarding both the employee and the traveler's companies.